Okay, so I have the really enjoyable role today, this afternoon, of welcoming everybody to this seminar. It's a real pleasure to see so much interest in it, both online, and we also have a few people who are lucky to be here in person as well. Huge welcome to you. My name is Laura Mulway. I'm one of the directors of the Deanery, and we are the organisation that is hosting our speakers today, hosting this event. And I'm sure lots of you have already heard of us. But this event is one in a series of events held together by a particular theme. And I'm really delighted to welcome today from UCL, Professor Michael Rice. Thank you for being here to speak to us. And we also have some homegrown academics on your panel today. So we have Dr. Judith Hillier and Dr. Steve Puttick, all here to bring you their expertise and their insights on this really important question of curriculum and sustainability for science. Just before I launch you into the input for today, I wanted to talk to you very briefly about the Deanery. Why are we hosting this event? What's going on? So that if you don't happen to be familiar with that, you have an understanding. The Deanery exists in this department to facilitate exchange between academics and academic research and those who could be in a position to use or to co-develop that research with us. So that's teachers, policymakers, parents, anyone really who the research of the education department can touch and support in some way. So this is one of the many events, online events that we run, but we also just want to make you briefly aware of the other things that the Deanery does before we launch today. You can read short, accessible summaries of research from this department on our website. We call these Deanery Digests, and I'm sure there will be some forthcoming from the team who are speaking with you today. You can listen to the research being produced in the department via our Deanery Digest podcast series, and you can also access resources that come out of the many events and activities from in the department on the website. We are growing our online learning provision as well. So you can see on the slide at the moment some of the current online training courses that are offered for free. If you're interested in any of those, please do go and take a look. And I said that this was one in a series of events. Some of the other upcoming events are on the screen now. In particular, I'd like to draw your attention to the Doing Brilliant Biology and Ecology Fieldwork event, which might be of particular relevance to some of our audience today. So that is all that I would like to say by way of introduction. I'm going to pass now to somebody who knows much more about the content of this event and where it has come from to give you some introduction now. So Professor Joanne Baird, please do take the stage.
So this seminar is part of a project that we have in the department on the future of curriculum and assessment. I'm a professor here in the department, but I've also been appointed by the Department for Education as part of their curriculum and assessment review that's ongoing. It started last year and it will finish in October or autumn this year. That review is looking at curriculum and assessment throughout all the school years in England. So lots has been done by the Department for Education to gather views, and they've had a consultation, they've had roadshows around the country. They're looking at research and data related to the curriculum and assessment and its effects. But we wanted in the department also to have a space for academic discussions around the kind of research that's been ongoing on specific topics related to curriculum. And clearly, issues of sustainability touch many subject areas and are absolutely crucial for the future of the planet. So that's why we've ended up with this topic today. We also have a website and you can sign up to the other seminars in this series. So we'll make sure that participants here today are aware of that too, in case there's anything else that you'd like to contribute to. But with that, I'd like to hand over to the experts in this area. And I'm really looking forward to hearing their views on what we ought to be doing for the future of the curriculum and assessment on sustainability. I'll hand over to you, Mike.
So great to be here, both in the room and to see people online. Laura and Joe, thank you very much to the Deanery, and Joanne, thank you very much for being the first person who contacted me for the invitation. I've got a decent chunk of time, and then Judith and Steve are going to do a response, and then we can open up for questions and comments. This was the title Steve and I sort of agreed on in the end. Sounds a bit dramatic, a new vision. I'll clarify what's meant by that for science and the national curriculum, and then the specific point, how should the curriculum deal with climate change? So, do we have a climate crisis? Well, the short answer is yes. But one of the things that's become so obvious the last 10, 20 years is the degree of politicization about issues to do with climate change. I've learned, of course, over the same sort of period, last 10, 20 years, that there's quite a lot in the science national curriculum and in science education more generally where this is the case. Vaccines is a current recent example, which until literally about 10 years ago, shortly before the COVID pandemic, I had never thought of, I'm afraid, as having any degree of controversy. Teaching of evolution, I was well aware, is a sensitive topic for many people. And climate crisis, this just shows, as you can see, that if you're in the US, your political affiliation correlates quite closely with how important you think climate change is. The standard graphs, which I'm pretty certain everybody here will know, go on about either global warming or carbon dioxide levels. So I just thought I'd show one or two other graphs that are to do with climate change. One of them is global average sea level rise. The amounts are fairly modest, as you can see. That's 250 millimeters, that's about 10 inches in 150 years. So some people might think, oh, we don't have to worry about that, lose a few countries, but frankly, we're not too bothered by that. Rate of increase is increasing, as you can see. And without going into a huge lecture about the physics of all of this, which Judith knows more about than I do, this is not good news. So other bits of not good news, the ocean is getting more and more acidic. And historically, I'll explain some of the significance of that. And there are a lot of other consequences of climate change. The person to whom I married is a geologist, and that's always very interesting, not just being married to her, but being a geologist, because they have a completely different sense of time. They think a few 100,000 years is incredibly brief. So at the moment, we are going through a rate of warming, in other words, the amount of average increase per temperature per year, that is an order of magnitude faster than after each of the 8 ice ages we've had in the last 800,000 years. We all know more about extreme weather events now, and they have incredible cost in human lives and human misery, and for people who only think about money, they have a lot of cost in terms of money as well. This one I only learned about recently, more earthquakes. Now, I have to be fair, these are not the sort of Richter scale 7, 8, 9 earthquakes. They're the sort of more modest ones. But what it literally is parts of the earth that have a lot of ice on them, when they now have less ice, they're a bit more likely to have earthquakes. I used to do some work in Iceland and got quite hooked at looking at their daily record of all the earthquakes in the last 24 hours on the island. This is one I always like pointing out because actually one of the consequences of current anthropogenic, human-caused climate change is that fewer people are dying from non-optimal temperatures. And that's because, amazingly, almost 10% of all human deaths each year across the world, okay, I'm not talking about Oxford, across the world, almost 10% of all human deaths are due to it either being too warm or too cold. But most of those are due to it being too cold. So hypothermia is much more of a problem. I always can never remember which one around those is. Being cold is more of a problem on average, being too hot. Very briefly, if you're a fruit bat in Australia, for example, or a howler monkey in South America, that's not the case. There are some species where the problem is being too hot. You may know 1/3 of all fruit bats in Australia in 48 hours a few years ago fell out of the trees dead because they literally overheated, for example. But in humans, global warming, to be fair, will reduce deaths from non-optimal temperatures. Increase in water shortages, more flooding, possible disappearance of some island nations, rise in animal-borne diseases. Overall, some will become less of a problem, but they're more than outweighed by others. And then we're getting to things that are really quite a long way away from the expertise of most of us who are science educators, query more wars and political instability. I just thought I'd put this in. This is a copy of an engraving by somebody who, even by the standards of his day, is now considered pretty racist, Louis Agassiz, but it's in Zermatt. And my father, where the Matterhorn is, and my grandfather happened to die on the Matterhorn. And therefore, this shows what the main glacier used to look like. And it's always difficult to compare with photographs, but I think you can see that a pretty contemporaneous photograph, there is a great deal less ice than there was. And my sister and I were in Zermatt the summer before last, and it is terrifying when you stand near these glaciers and the volume of meltwater that is coming off them. So you probably know we lost, well, you may not know actually, Europe lost 6% of its volume of ice in glaciers in the last year for which we have data, and 4% the previous year. So it is happening very fast. The consequences of climate change for other species are far greater. So this is a coral reef, and there are two problems: the heat and getting more acidic, to be honest. And because, as I was glad Joanne mentioned this, although climate change is in the title, the real issues are not only climate change, they're about sustainability more generally. I just thought I'd whiz through mass extinctions. So to a geologist, a mass extinction is when 3/4 or more of all species are thought to have gone extinct rapidly, which, given my earlier comment about geologists, you probably won't be surprised to hear means within 2 million years. Right? So that's very rapid for extinction for geologists. The average mammal in the fossil record lasts about 1 million years, typically. Mostly they then give rise to daughter species, but the particular species on average last about 1 million years. I won't go through this in huge detail, but it's worth mentioning the first one we know about, the end of the Ordovician, was probably partly to do with global cooling. The second one, the Devonian, was fascinating because this one we're pretty certain about. It's because of colonization of the land by plants. You get a lot of green vegetation. They take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The carbon dioxide level falls, and therefore it gets cooler. So it was global cooling again. The Permian is the big one. We think probably 96% of all species went extinct, and it was down to volcanoes. And I've tried reading, and I can't understand why there was such a problem with volcanic activity at that point, but there was. And similarly, the end of the Triassic is underground volcanoes in this case. And then the one that lots of people do know about, because it genuinely is the asteroid that caused the end of the Cretaceous. About just over 3/4, we think, of all species went extinct, including every species of animal with a mass of more than about 25 kilograms. Every species, not just the dinosaurs, everything that was big. Are we living through the sixth mass extinction? Well, the answer is not yet. The best data, this is just a scientist in me, the best data come from snails and mollusks and things like that, where there's been a really good study. And we think that between 7.5% and 13%, so that's quite a lot, about 1 in 10, of all mollusk species have gone extinct in the last sort of 500-ish years, which is a rate of extinction, apart from things like asteroids, is pretty near unparalleled. Vertebrate extinction rates, it looks like they're 100 times the background rate. So I said that the typical duration of a mammalian species is about 1 million years. So we're now talking about those on average at the moment being about 10,000 years. And overall, actually, extinction rates for terrestrial plants and animals, others have estimated 1,000 times the background rate. at least. I thought I'd put in 4 photos. This is cuckoo, that's swift, that's a pipistrelle, and I think most of you know that's a hedgehog. Back to Jenny, to whom I married. We've lived in the same house now for 41 years, the only house we've lived in. And when we first moved to that house, 6 miles from Cambridge, we got all of those in the garden, or you could hear them from the garden. You don't get any of them now. We haven't had any of them for several years. It takes a while to appreciate biodiversity change, and I could talk a long time about it, but last year was by far the worst ever in recorded history in the UK, for example, for bumblebees and for butterflies. Now, the role of school science education. So that's the sort of backdrop, if you like. There have been a number of what I found rather useful overarching frameworks about trying to think what we should be doing in school science education. And one of them is powerful knowledge, which some of you will know extremely well, associated with the name of Michael Young. Just mentioning quickly, because I've written with John White about human flourishing, Michael Young and I are occasionally paired as sort of, total antagonists. These debates go extremely badly, because we agree on about 97% of everything to do with the school science curriculum, which isn't surprising. He was a chemistry teacher, I'm a biology teacher. We're both quite interested in children learning about science, and we both actually have a view about that's not the only thing you want education to be about. But he has particularly emphasized that the one thing that schools can really do, I think I'm putting words in his mouth now, but he would say to help develop humans so they're flourishing, is to help them understand the sort of knowledge they don't gain through other sources. So, Judith, I had lunch yesterday with a colleague and a friend who is a philosopher, and for some bizarre reason, I don't really know why, we do this about 2 or 3 times a year for over 15 years. He picked up the salt shaker on the table, held it over the edge and said, I've never known much science. What happens? Why does it happen that it falls down if I drop it? So I wasn't quite sure what level to go in at this, but I wanted to say something that would interest him. So I tried to get him, and I succeeded, to understand, roughly speaking, Newton's third law, that the Earth accelerates up towards the salt cellar, and the salt cellar accelerates downwards towards the Earth. And as you all, probably most of you know, perhaps all of you, this is Newton's second law, if you multiply together the rate of acceleration by the mass of the salt cellar, it exactly equals, but is opposite in direction, to the mass times the acceleration upwards of the Earth. And I had to go through this quite slowly to him, so I'm sorry for some of you don't know that, and I rushed it. But it is one of those wonderful examples where if you are taught something by a teacher in almost any school subject, it helps you see the world differently. I was taught geography extremely badly, school extremely badly. I now know with hindsight, if I'd had, a couple of the people sitting here, I would have been fascinated by it. One would have learned things that I have never known, Steve, Laura, and perhaps others. That's just Michael's key points summarized. The main function of school is to enable all students to acquire knowledge that takes them beyond their experience. And therefore, I just thought I'd mention some of the standard arguments you get against climate change. This comes from Royal Society report. We ought to have students who, by the time they leave school, whatever their own views about climate change, they should know the scientific arguments against these arguments. It's just like I don't mind if some students decide they don't want to accept the theory of evolution, but they should understand, they should know what the scientific theory of evolution is and what the scientific consensus is about it. So in terms of climate change, the Earth's climate is always changing. Well, I mentioned that in terms of all these ice ages, for example, and this is nothing to do with humans. Computer models which predict the future climate are unreliable and based on a series of assumptions. Now, the second half of that is good. That's exactly what a model is all about, something based on a series of assumptions. So we're getting somewhere. And the third one, it's all to do with the sun. Most of you will know this, the idea that there's a strong link between increased temperatures on Earth and the number of sunspots. There is if you measure it over about 15 years, but not longer, is the short answer. Now, within school science education over the last 30 years, one of the big debates has been about the balance we want between what might loosely be described as the sort of content of science, the scientific knowledge about things like the periodic table or photosynthesis or Newton's laws, as I mentioned, laws of motion more generally, that sort of robust scientific knowledge that's built up, and helping students to understand how it's built up. So sometimes this is called the nature of science. That was the phrase given in England in 1989 for the first version of the national curriculum. It's gone through various changes through then. Sometimes it's called working scientifically or how science works, but it means much the same sort of thing. More recently, this is an argument of Jonathan Osborne's, what we mean by the nature of science has shifted a bit. So Jonathan has argued very convincingly, in my view, that it's important that school science tackles issues to do with misinformation, particularly misinformation in science. And that seems one of the good roles we'd hope that a good education would do. And then this is just a slightly longer argument, but we need an education in science that helps students understand how scientists practice science, including the role of modeling in hypothesis testing and theory generation. This would help students to understand better whether the future of climate change is likely simply to be a linear progression from the present or entail tipping points, for example, to ocean currents, in which there are sudden changes that can only be reversed over very long periods of time. Now, just to tell you here, there is utterly no doubt it'll be tipping points. There is zero chance of it all being linear. But over a short period of time, which is all we've got, the changes are either linear or they go slightly upwards, low rates of exponents if you have an exponential decay, or if it's a polynomial, they're just, x squared and the x squareds aren't multiplied by too much, etc. But we know there'll be tipping points because we know as confidently as we can know anything in science that there have been these in the past. There have been times in the past where the climate within a generation has gone up by an average of 6 to 7 degrees centigrade, for example. What we don't know well enough is exactly why, nor at what point you, as it were, tip the seesaw so you can't get it back, sort of thing. I don't know about you, but I keep on reading. There are a lot of papers at the moment about the currents in the North Atlantic, the ocean currents. There was a lot of worry about a year and a half ago that for those of you who have children, in your children's lifetime, it would stop, the present stop. Now, what that would mean for the, roughly speaking, the west of England and Scotland, so the west of the UK, is it's difficult to quantify, but maybe in winter an average of 8 degrees centigrade colder. It would just be like the east coast of North USA, sort of thing. So it would be a fundamental change. And we know it's reversed in the past, and we're pretty sure it would take thousands of years to get it back, even if global temperatures went right back to what they were 100 years ago. So these tipping points, and you'd want a good science education, at least children to know about the possibility of these. And there's quite a lot of, bits of work you can do about them that makes them quite interesting. There's the issue of interdisciplinarity within science. Now, we don't do this very well in school science because most of us are confident teaching biology or chemistry or physics. I can teach biology fine. I can teach bits of physics, and I get rather nervous whenever I used to have to teach chemistry in school, particularly if I was, in charge of practical work or something like that. Then we don't in this country handle earth science at all well. I mean, I don't know if you want to say in geography a bit later whether you handle it well in geography in a sense, but we do not in science. We dump a tiny bit of it in chemistry. And compared to most countries around the world, we teach less about earth science in science than they do. And it's a pretty important topic, particularly to do with climate change. Quick anecdote. Some of you will have heard me say this before. I thought the sort of pinnacle of my academic career came about when I was on the Science National Curriculum Review Working Group about 15 years ago. Robin Miller and I were the two sort of science educators on it, and it was good because there were science teachers, there were one or two people from industry, there were a number of people from professional organizations and so on. And it just descended into complete chaos, to be honest. But the bit that's relevant to the talk today is we were given only one instruction at the beginning of the series of meetings. The only instruction we were given by a civil servant was that Michael Gove did not want climate change in this sense. Now, this was quite easy to get around because you can talk about changes in composition of the atmosphere over time and things like that. And of course, when you then hand it over to a civil service, the ones who do know what you mean are rather glad it's there, and the other ones don't quite know what's meant by it. And there's, in fact, the phrase ended up coming back in because these things go out for consultation. But that's why it's very thin, very thin. Fascinating enough, the Conservative government at the time, for quite interesting reasons that I do think I understand, were very keen to get evolution in. So that's why, as a country, we have more evolution in the primary science curriculum than virtually any other country in the world. And there's even quite a bit of progression, which is rare in school science. You know, there's a sort of logic, because we were told to put it in, more or less, ish, or at least we started putting it in. You know what I mean? You either get pushback or you get the opposite, and we got the opposite. So we kept on putting more and more in. Lecture mode for a minute. I don't know if there's anybody in the room of my generation, but anyway, people of my generation, when we were at school, we had what's called Vision 1 for science education. Of course, we didn't know it was Vision 1 because the only vision there was at the time. So you never know these things, and there's only one possibility. Vision 1 is all about getting that really good, secure knowledge of robust science. And it's done because there's an implicit hope that a reasonable proportion of the students would get enthused by this and want to choose science once it's no longer compulsory and eventually study it either in a job or at university and go on to it for a career. Vision 2, which began to be argued much more about 20-ish years ago, is much more to do with what's sometimes called scientific literacy for all. So it's a more inclusive model. It's the argument, look, roughly speaking, 80% of people don't end up in jobs where they really need much science at all. But, you know, you teach science from age 5 in England right through to age 16. It often gets 20% of the curriculum time at secondary schools. So it's not fair if the science education is only meant for those who become professional or academic scientists. So there's been quite a battle between Vision 1 and Vision 2. Vision 3, which possibly not as many of you will know, is a commitment to trying to tackle issues to do with social justice through the school science curriculum. So climate change would fit there fairly well, but briefly, just give one other example, one might teach genetics rather differently. You might choose to have within a school genetics curriculum a bit about the misuse of genetics, either breeding things like broilers in chickens that are permanently in pain because their bodies are too heavy to be supported by their legs, or the history of eugenics in humans, for example. So it would make quite a difference. Let me link in the student interest with the next bullet point. At some point, when you're putting together a curriculum, there are many, many ways in which curricula are put together, but you've got to decide on the sort of balance you want between getting students to know stuff, and that knowledge, by the way, could be both the content knowledge and the nature of science knowledge I mentioned earlier. It's knowledge, understanding how science is built up over time. These are not four independent things, but it's worth just specifying them to think about them each. Second one is student engagement, because in a lot of countries, as you will know, there's this rather depressing statistic that roughly actually that's badly phrased. Can I start again? Around the world, there's an inverse correlation at the level of countries between how well students do on international tests like PISA and TIMSS and the average measure of student engagement, enthusiasm, interest in science. So the countries that do the best, you know, your Singapore's, parts of China, Japan, things like that, Korea. I mean, Japanese young women, so I'm making jokes, but it's dire. It's just absolutely dire. All they're wanting to do is leave it. That's the point. This country, actually, England and the other nations within the UK, thankfully doesn't do too badly on student engagement. And actually, internationally, among wealthy countries, we have rather a high proportion of people who go on to study science once it's no longer compulsory, thankfully. So we're in a better position than many. You've got to think about student skills. They could be science-specific skills like, you know, using a microscope, knowing how to take accurate measurements with physics apparatus, titration in chemistry, or they could be more generic skills, working in groups, doing a presentation, etc. And then logically, there's a possibility of student action, which I'm only really mentioning because it'll come up a bit later. Now, those decisions are not really informed by empirical research. There's no way of doing a nice little project gathering data to decide on which of student knowledge, student engagement, student skills, and student action you want to develop. It's a principal decision, or it's just a decision that sort of gets vaguely made implicitly, one or the other. You know, you ask me for how you teach photosynthesis well, there's an enormous literature, pretty robust. We know what to do quite well. It'll be the same, no doubt, in other subject knowledge. Getting towards the end, we're very fortunate in the science education community, both internationally and in the UK, that there is a lot of consensus. It is actually a very friendly community in my experience. This is not the case in every subject area. So I am very keen, because it ends up being for the good of students, that you try and maintain that consensus as far as possible. And curriculum change does tend to be often made a bit more slowly than sometimes science educators would like, because you have got to work with extraordinarily busy teachers, under-resourced, you know, not able to do the amount of practical work they'd like to do for all sorts of reasons. You've got to try and keep the whole community on board, the whole community, the teachers, the educators, the people who write textbooks, the inspectoral system, the awarding bodies, and so on. I thought I'd mention very briefly, because I've got involved, we've got a centre at UCL called the Centre for Climate Change and Sustainable Education, and we decided not to produce, these are free models for teachers at primary and secondary level, they're basically professional development modules. We decided not to start with science because it seemed too obvious, so we started with geography and history. I'm not going to be brave enough to say anything about the geography ones in the present company. There will probably be some historians here. It's just I knew there were going to be a couple of geography educators. But the history one, for example, argues that one should start further back in history than most usual school curricula do. So you may or may not know that all these huge megafaunas, you know, these big elephants, the woolly mammoths and so on, just interrupting myself, how many of you just in the room saw the story yesterday about these woolly mice? Give me strength, give me strength. He makes Donald Trump look like a principled, wise person. But anyway, we're not going to get mammoths back in the Arctic, whether we breed furry mice or not. But all these big animals, we're now pretty certain. There's a tiny bit of controversy, which might be a good topic to do, actually, in either history or science. But it's pretty certain they were all hunted to extinction in the last 60,000 years by humans. I'm afraid they're all big herbivores. They move relatively slowly, or even if they move fast, they can be pushed over the edges. They can be persuaded to fall into tar pits or off cliffs, basically. And this is a gorgeous one, which I've got to mention. I don't know, is there any history education in the room or not? Not bothered at all if there isn't. Good. There's less chance I got it wrong. Really something confident. Right. So Yeah, I know. Yeah, well, yeah, we just pulled something out. We've lost the link on that. Right. So some people know historically what's often called the Little Ice Age, which is all these medieval paintings, late medieval paintings, of suddenly frost fairs on the Thames, or gorgeous scenes painted by Bruegel the Elder and others of freezing weather on the continent. The reason the Little Ice Age happens, we're now fairly sure, is because when the conquistadors in Spain and to a certain extent Portugal went to South America, they both intentionally and unintentionally carried diseases with them. And we now think that in some countries, over 90% of the indigenous peoples died in 2 generations as a result of diseases, and the agriculture of a number of South American countries collapsed. Okay. When the agriculture collapses, the interesting thing, of course, is you don't get the crops that people are growing, but you get far more wild plants. They photosynthesize far more. Therefore, the carbon dioxide levels fell in the atmosphere. Therefore, you get a little ice age, which was historically incredibly important for a whole range of reasons, but all probably links up to that. So, last slide, I think pretty much said, this was a rare burst of enthusiasm from the DFE because it was at the time when the climate change COP was held at Glasgow. So it was felt politically we had to take a lead, and we did for several weeks. This is a quote from a DFE document. Practical opportunities to participate in activities to increase climate resilience, reduce carbon impact, and enhance biodiversity will enable children and young people to translate knowledge into positive action. Don't normally get that in DFE statements, okay? To improve their local communities, their country, and the planet. So that was the 4th of the various things I said you'd have to think about what you want from a curriculum, starting with student knowledge at one end, all the way through to student action. The second statement is far more typical of the DFE. It would not be appropriate for a teacher to suggest that pupils join a certain campaigning group or engage in certain political activity, for example, an upcoming protest. And the bit of me that wants to be a bit unfair says we can't have children protesting against torture or something like that. That would be quite inappropriate. Right, I think that's enough of me. Over to Judith and Steve. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm just going to wait for the PowerPoints to magically change over. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Judith Hillier. I'm Associate Professor here of Science Education, been a science teacher educator for about 15 years here in the department full-time, and I used to be a physics teacher and a physicist before that. And I am not sitting here with my Institute of Physics Vice Principal for Learning and Skills hat on, so don't quote me as officially representing them at the moment in time. But also join work that I've done with Joanne in Project Calibrate, and sort of summing up as can we have tests that are worth teaching to as a useful thing to think about. And I'm going to start, I've brought on a couple of books for people in the room to see, but also I've put pictures online so people online can see. Michael's mentioned several times the importance of the oceans. If you have not read Helen Skepsi's books about the Blue Machine, if you would like to know more about ocean science, I would really, really recommend it. And there's a couple of things that, this is a quote from page 381 that I wanted just to sort of bring out for you. And I wanted to sort of really emphasize that there's this sort of idea of following the science. We had a lot of that in 2020, didn't we? We're just following the science. And she says very clearly, science does not lead. Leadership comes from a statement of values, and then we use the best available information in order to decide how to act according to those values. But we have to decide for ourselves and our communities, what do we care about? How do we prioritize social justice, economic gains, individual freedom, community values, and the rest? And the answers might be different in different situations. They're hard questions. They have nuance and they depend on things that depend on other things. But once you've made a decision about your values, then science and science education has a contribution to make, because it gives us the best understanding about how to get there. And so I thought actually it'd be useful to step back and think a little bit about what are the values underpinning our curriculum. And I'm going to start with a comment. So this was a former PGC intern. He now happens to be my son's physics teacher, which I'm quite glad about. After a week in the course, he came to me and said, I used to think that teachers were required to be politically neutral. We've had that quote from Michael said from the DFE. It's not appropriate for teachers to encourage students to do that. And he came and said, actually, the very act of having a curriculum is a political position. I thought, excellent, job done. That's one of the most important things to, is to think about. Is the curriculum itself is a political beast, and you might think that there are people who very much have a transactional view to life. That people's, plants, animals, minerals are commodities to be traded, exploited, used without a thought for a future. And if those are your values, then learning becomes a very transactional process. I have paid this tuition fee, therefore I get this qualification. And there's a question about that, is though, do we like that? Is that how we want to be? This is a quote from a GCSE textbook. In English, if anybody studied GCSE in the last 15 or 20 years, you might know which text this comes from. This is from J.B. Priestley's An Inspector Calls, and it's the inspector's final speech. Thank you. I thought any teacher, and it's, although, I think the GCSE set text needs a huge amount of revision, this message that we do not live alone, we are members of one body, we are responsible for each other, and that if we don't listen to that value, we are going to end up in trouble, is a really powerful message that he wrote back in 1945, and I would argue is still very much true today. So what are the values underpinning our curriculum? If we don't take that transitional point, and I have deliberately done this as a binary, and dichotomies are always problematic, but raising that actually, if we want our students to understand that we are part of a planetary ecosystem on which our species depends for survival, that we need to curate the resources in a sustainable way, then actually learning becomes about flourishing. And at this point, I'm going to again pull up a book that Michael published over 10 years ago. Again, pictures online for people who are online, that actually schools surely should be about enabling every student to form a broad background of understanding so they can go out into the world. But it is also about how do you help students to be able to lead a personally flourishing life, and how do you help them to help other people to live personally flourishing lives. If you ask any parent, to have their child flourishing is actually what we'll be able to say is the most important thing. So I thought I didn't actually realise that Michael was going to say what he said, but I did actually go into the current national curriculum and I searched for the word climate. These are the only statements in the whole of secondary science where the word climate appears. Okay? At the age 11 to 14, they should be taught about the production of carbon dioxide by human activity and the impact on climate. And at ages 11, 14 to 16, they should be taught about the evidence and uncertainties in evidence for additional anthropogenic causes of climate change, and then about the carbon monoxide. And this time we get to learn about methane as well. If you search for sustainability, it doesn't appear at all. There is no mention of sustainability in the Science National Curriculum. And so I thought it'd be useful just to share that with the audience, if you hadn't done that checking for yourselves, to show how broken our current science curriculum is. Students have to memorize a whole bunch of stuff about monoclonal antibodies, but they don't learn about climate change. So this is where I would argue that vision needs to be. It needs to be thinking about the curriculum and the assessment and the pedagogies that intertwine all of those things together. That if we are going to have Students and teachers in schools recognise that we're part of a planetary ecosystem, to understand that importance, to be empowered about advocating for change, and to be able to choose to live in a sustainable and flourishing way. We need significant change and we need significant dialogue. Because the current curriculum and the current assessment will not achieve any of those things. And that is my final point. Now I'm going to hand over now to Steve.
Thanks very much, Judith. The zoomy thing's there, so you want to either make sure that I'm not on it, or well, I am on it. No, I haven't got any slides. That's it. I can see.
You will be.
Okay, I'll stand here. So thanks very much. As the lone geographer up here, I was kind of like waiting to see quite the way in which our kind of conversation went, to decide kind of what might usefully be contributed. And I'm now torn between about 1 billion different things that I want to try to speak to. And I think that's partly kind of illustrates one of the big challenges that I want to kind of flag up at this point. The kind of curriculum challenge of knowledge. And so this big kind of question that obviously Michael Young, Michael Wraith, and John White and others have kind of wrestled with in that kind of big debate around kind of power of knowledge and kind of aims-based or knowledge-based. And ultimately kind of making this argument that knowledge is important. And the kind of geographical answer to that very quickly becomes kind of what knowledge and whose knowledge. I think there's a couple of really interesting kind of reflections on maybe kind of last 20 years or so of geographical education. So the kind of not even a blink in the geologist's eye of curriculum development. And so one is about the speed with which the debates about climate change have changed. And so in 2006, I was in this department learning to become a geography teacher. And there was a front cover of I think the Observer newspaper that had a picture of David Attenborough on it. And the headline was about him deciding and him saying, I'm finally convinced climate change is real and is caused by humans. 2006 isn't that long ago, and yet it's unthinkable now to have an environmentalist on the front page of a national newspaper saying, oh, I think climate change is caused by humans. The speed at which those discourses have kind of happened, I think it's really staggering. And at the same time, geographical education has been playing this kind of game of catch up to say, right, what do we include in the curriculum and how do we go about that? So at that point, the debates in geography education were very much sustainable development, education for sustainable development. But if you looked at the way in which fossil fuels are engaged with, the big question was, do we have renewable or non-renewable energy sources? You need to have renewable because the non-renewable stuff's going to run out. The problem with coal, gas and so on is that it's going to run out and then there won't be any more. And then how do you power your cars and stuff? Looking at that now, that seems like an incredibly trivial point. They're kind of running out. That'd be a good thing if there was less in some ways. But it kind of makes me think then about this question. What knowledge did the students in school then kind of gain from that? How useful is that knowledge that it was going to run out, which in some ways you might say at a very trivial level that's true, but essentially that's not useful knowledge. That's not powerful knowledge really, in the sense that you'd want to describe it. And I think that's a useful and interesting kind of case study to look at, to think, okay, in what ways might that knowledge and the teaching of those kind of things have been made more useful? And I think some of these debates about the nature of science, I think are really valuable. And in geography, we've kind of, Alison and I did a brief paper on kind of nature of geography, trying to ask these questions about how students can be brought into these epistemological debates, where they're not just learning something, it's going to run out, but in fact they're learning kind of how we've come to understand that, what kind of knowledge we've had to rely on. And I think that point about relying is the other kind of really interesting thing that geography does to these debates in terms of asking questions about whose knowledge counts. And so you've heard lots of times people talk about the particular subject areas that they're experts in and the areas they're not experts in. And Michael tell a story to his philosopher friend, lunch companion, about salt, and explain in this kind of way, I didn't know the earth accelerates upwards, what? Anyway, but the kind of the expertise and the knowledge that's held by different people is really significant. And there's an interesting paper by Demerit that tries to kind of get into some of these epistemological questions. And he uses this frame about standing downstream. And so he talks about the ways in which geographers, and he says, like many scientists, are standing downstream in relation to these big climate models. And so the really complex algorithms that we need to use to understand the climate, this huge long-term whole Earth system scale thing made up of an incredibly complex range of interactions between different types of aspects of that huge Earth system. None of us in this room would be able to kind of create an accurate climate model on our computer. None of us probably, maybe President country, be able to kind of run this model. And so that notion of kind of standing downstream means that there's a huge amount of this epistemological trust that's placed, and essentially testimonial knowledge, which I think is really interesting when you contrast it with the way in which David Attenborough framed that article in 2006 when he said, "I'm convinced. That's it. The data's clear. Look at the graphs, it's clear." And then repeated lots of that argument in his opening kind of presentation to the COP presentation. I'm sure many of you have seen. It's a really powerful speech, seeing parts per million of carbon concentration kind of going up, and then lots of dramatic images of stuff happening in climate breakdown, and says to these world leaders, this all comes down to one number. All of the rest of the negotiations come down to this one number, and that's the only way in which this will be able to be judged. What's the parts per million, and what have you done about that? In one level, obviously, politically, you need to have really clear targets, but obviously it's not down to one number. And obviously there's a huge complex interaction of lots of different things. But I think illustrates this kind of big question about complexity and how school subjects that engage with complexity, how they engage with these huge Earth systems in ways that we can look back, and someone standing here in 20 years' time can look back and not say, well, that was essentially wrong what they were being taught, but that can have been taught things that were useful and really wrestled with these questions. And so I think for me, that big question about how knowledge is produced, how children can be brought into this conversation about the construction of knowledge and the ways in which we're taking on lots and lots of different types of knowledges, how they can look across different disciplines. Geography often does that by just saying that it's all geography. And so we get stuff that's from chemists, physicists, economists, whatever. And we're like, yeah, this is geography. And then does this kind of thing to try and package it up. Sometimes not with great results, as we heard Michael say about his geography teachers not being ideal. And you find that kind of throughout the history of what seems to be this incredible subject. And so Joseph Conrad famously talked about his geography teachers. And he talked about these kind of awful people who were teaching geography. And he said, not only were they old, they looked as if they'd never been young. He talks about the way in which their kind of desire for the exploration is just kind of completely non-existent. And yet, just kind of like spouting these facts that are needing to be taught. His view of geography was that it was about kind of being out there and experiencing the world. And again, for me, that creates a kind of a particular challenge for this current moment, is how you navigate these kind of claims that are made about whole system and long term with students and young people's immediate experiences. So you can't experience the climate on one level because it's about longer term averages, experience weather. And yet we've got this kind of really interesting correlation and the whole kind of field of attribution science, which I'm separately tuning into next week's webinar with Jericho as well. But this question about attribution and how you make these connections feels to me like kind of today's version of the kind of it's running out type challenge, how you can engage really intelligently with these complex relationships between what young people are feeling and experiencing now and some of these much longer term challenges. And the last point that I just want to reflect on briefly is this notion of action and the ways in which you want the curriculum to bring people into kind of changing things as well. I think there's some interesting kind of reflections on the way that geography has done that. There's a forthcoming paper. James, how's it going? Is it nearly submitted? Yeah, there we go. Watch this space. But it just kind of touches on these arguments, and we'll take them further, and will be fascinating to read once it's finished. But the argument, the basic argument that we're making there is that lots of the way in which climate change education is framed really accelerates young people to take action, but in a way that's very constrained. And so we had that great example of the way that the curriculum was set up and has this kind of anti-politicization, essentially, so you can't join these protests and stuff. So often the geography response has been micro actions, lots and lots of school projects where we say young people, framed under the notion of empowering, you can make a difference. You can save energy, you can reduce energy consumption. And so we have projects to try and turn off all IT equipment and lights before leaving. And we have students being told, try and do this, you can make a difference. You should fly less and you should do these kinds of things. But often at the expense of this kind of larger scale, like political and system level change. And that to me feels like a real challenge, a kind of curriculum challenge, is the question of action. That you absolutely want a curriculum that doesn't leave young people just with kind of knowledge or just with facts. But there's an incredibly hard kind of connection, almost in terms of that classic social science dilemma between what is and what ought to be. And I think sitting with that kind of dilemma is a really important one to kind of empower teachers to engage with well, and so that it can kind of progress that debate from being either this kind of quite simplistic, like no politicization, or kind of direct kind of into action. But yeah, for me, those kind of questions about change, those questions about the speed of which this knowledge has changed, questions about expertise and interdisciplinarity and the importance of engaging students in this really rich question about knowledge and its production. And then these big questions about action and so on. It's complex. So there are a number of questions online already. Thanks so much for engaging with those. Michael, there were some that were put up during your initial. So if we have a look at those questions and you respond to those and we open it up more broadly. I'm conscious that we've got 18 minutes, so I feel obviously going to get to a situation where we can't kind of address everything. So I think it'd be really helpful if you do have questions to use the chat, and then maybe we can kind of bring some together as we go on. But there was a question early on when you were speaking about let's jump to Kim's question here. Climate change science isn't a theory, is it?
So one of the things we're very keen about in school science is that children get to think about what the word theory means, because as we know in everyday language, the phrase "it's only a theory" is often used to suggest there isn't much substance behind it. So the theory of evolution is a theory, the theory of general relativity is a theory. They're both wonderfully well substantiated. Climate change is really interesting because there's a lot more uncertainty than there is about general relativity or the theory of evolution, actually. And that's because it's on the sort of frontier. So, you know, you were talking about David Attenborough in 2006. When I was at school, I can remember in the sixth form, the front page of the New Scientist genuinely talking about whether we were going into an ice age. Because, of course, if it wasn't a human activity, that is the natural state we should be going towards. And there was a poll at the time where about 1/3 of experts thought it was going to be an ice age next, and 2/3 thought, no, human activity is probably going to cause it to warm. But it was genuinely unsure. We're not unsure any longer.
There was a question as well about the comment about the number of deaths. So presumably the number of deaths from heat may well increase as the deaths from cold decrease.
That's it, yes. I mean, I don't know if you think that's good news or bad news, but because at the moment the number of deaths globally from cold is more than the number of deaths from excessive heat, my point is that it's always good to be honest with students. It's not the case that every single consequence of anthropogenic climate change is bad for humans. This is an example where it's good for humans. It's completely outweighed by all the other bad effects. But a good education should be an honest education that gets people to look at all the consequences.
And just to follow up on that, it was interesting when you mentioned about the kind of expertise that are, I think you used to phrase something like a long way from the science education. So when you think about kind of political questions and so on. In terms of making that value judgment about something being kind of a good effect or a bad effect, to what extent does science education now kind of do that? to what extent do you kind of...
So very briefly, in health education, you roughly speaking just implicitly assume that dead people are not as good as live people who want to remain alive.
Yeah.
And we don't go into some sort of deep moral philosophy on it, but the whole of school biology education to do with humans is pretty much premised on those sort of implicit assumptions. So, you know, people dying of heat stroke, we usually think is not desirable. Business want to comment?
I think that's something that's missing within the physics curriculum. There's a tiny bit when you talk about the sort of the ethics of renewable energy resources, but there is not the history of nuclear power and the ethics of that and nuclear weapons is not discussed. The ethics of so much of our physics knowledge and the measurements that were used to, you know, confirm the diameter of the Earth and the size of the Earth was built on data that was collected as part of the British Empire. We don't talk about those things, and the way that physicists' knowledge has been built on the backs of exploitation is not discussed. It should be.
Yeah, and in the chat, the media is making a really similar point about some of those aspects. I'm going to bring up this question here. I'd like to hear from Meryl. I'd like to hear about the potential for hands-on investigations into nature-based solutions in the science curriculum to make learning relevant and engaging.
So there is quite a lot of, if by hands-on is meant literal sort of practical work. Your point earlier on about the time these things take, Steve, is very good, because it's not like doing a quick little practical about the effect of exercise on human heart rate, which takes 30 seconds and works every time. So this is an example where there is a certain amount of conventional practical work, but you also want students to see simulations. You want them to see videos of demonstrations, and you want them to engage in thought experiments. So in my view, it's quite a rich example of how science advances, and that is very much how academics who work in climate science operate themselves.
I think the thing that you also want students to do is to engage with their environment. You don't need to have a big trip out to the woods to go and investigate nature, but that idea that you can look what's in your playground, what are the living things living on the walls of your building, your school building, and how are those being affected by what we as people are doing? There needs to be space within the curriculum, and that needs to be resourced. And teachers need to feel that that is a valued part of their time and effort, because it does take time and effort to be creative. It's much easier sometimes just to go, right, just learn these facts. Less good for being a teacher, less good for being a kid, but it can sometimes be easier.
And have you got any examples where someone's managed to do something like that in their local school about the particular issue of climate change? So I'm interested in this question about how there's kind of a tension between you can't feel it, you can't really see it, but yet you kind of
the most common ones in my experience are to do with a mixture of present data collection on how many days is there frost, for example, during the school term, and then historical records on recent historical records in how many days did there used to be frost. That's not, for some people, the most exciting sort of practical work, hence my point about a range of ways of collecting data. And of course, if you're teaching GCSE psychology, it's quite a good example of the ways in which humans are able to deny things. Certain things are much easier to deny than other things. Things that happen rather slowly, happen a long way away, etc., etc.
And I think that the scope for that tends to be happening within science clubs or within things like extended project qualifications, which are done by a tiny minority of students. So if you're talking about opportunities for everybody to engage with these ideas and to learn, it doesn't happen.
And just think about some of those graphs that you showed, that the kind of central line goes like this. Does the timescale question mean that kind of thing of collecting something last year, 5 years ago, means that actually within that line the kind of noise is meaningless, or is there scope to kind of do some?
Well, you wouldn't be well advised to do a PhD actually collecting data on changes in ocean acidification, because even over a 3-year full time, there's too much risk, as you say, scatter. Now, of course, in one sense, both in school science and in school mathematics, and there's been a lot of really good work in school mathematics about teaching about statistics and trends, that's one of the sort of things you want to introduce children to, but it's not, of course, as immediate an effect as dropping a small piece of sodium into water and measuring the pH before and after and noticing the bang and, you know, hydrogen coming off and so on. It's not, but it's part of how science works. Very briefly, anybody who does astronomy in school knows it's the same thing. You know, half the time it's cloudy, you go out, you don't see the 7 planets in planetary alignment. Occasionally, of course, it just works absolutely wonderfully and is near transformative.
Lauren, I don't know if you want to read out your question or I can read it.
Hey, and just to say as well, in response to what you said, Steve, I think the primary geographers are much better than the secondary at doing, like, they've got an inquiry for action cycle where secondary don't. So my question for you, Michael, and for everyone is, it was a really interesting discussion, but in your presentation, you kind of drew on maths and graphs, drawings and photographs, talked about geology and time and history and geography education. So given this and what you said about interdisciplinarity and the context of a curriculum review, should there be more explicit time and direction to interdisciplinary teaching and learning in school and national curricula and an IT curriculum?
Way above my pay grade.
Okay.
So I've given up any attempts, I can tell you, at any co-teaching between teachers of different subjects. In my experience, it only works extraordinarily rare. I quite like suspended timetable days.
Yeah.
There's still 1 day a year, each year in secondary, because schools can organise, so that's not impossible. And actually, in my experience, which is anecdotal, not properly written up, you know, students remember those sort of things for a long time after. And often those things are quite useful for something like environmental education or health education, where everybody gets stuck in. Primary, of course, we're in a different ballgame because, of course, in many countries, including England, it's still the case that the vast majority of the teaching is done by one teacher. So if that teacher is reasonably comfortable, reasonably good, then that sort of interdisciplinary, sometimes project-based work is still far more feasible.
You want to? Yeah.
No, that's fine. I think we've got a question in the room.
Well, I had a point to build off the discussion that you were having, and that's that we often think of students' education on a year-by-year basis. So while something may not be obvious within 1 year, it might be obvious across a student's educational career. So rather than a teacher sort of doing a bunch of measurements 1 year and you chuck it out and start from scratch, you can build up a data set year on year. A student can go out, collect a certain piece of data, and then see what it looks like at the end of their time in primary. So that's
great. I like that a lot. And I did run a longitudinal project for orchid mapping in a local orchid wood when I taught in schools, because we had the most northern distribution in Europe of one particular species. I have to say, most teenagers were never very interested in the data collected by previous cohorts. You know what I mean? No problem getting them enthused. But I'm with you in principle.
I had another point that, again, building off something that you mentioned earlier and a discussion about the importance of bringing math into this discussion, because a lot of the stuff about science, it needs to be taught alongside an understanding of probability and risk and assessing risk. Because especially we're talking about climate, we're not talking about each individual hurricane getting stronger than the last. It's the risk of a very strong hurricane being increasing. And then we need to help students to evaluate that risk. So we had the same thing in COVID. What was really missing is an ability for the general public to evaluate risk of wearing a mask versus not wearing a mask. You know, and that's not something that science can make a decision for you. You need to make a decision on what is the risk level that you are able to accept.
I'm so sorry, I don't know if you're a maths educator or not, right? Because, I mean, and Watson, this department, for example, was always incredibly keen on the capacity of maths education in schools to look at issues to do with justice, even just through choices of what examples you studied in school. It's not very difficult. That's the rather nice thing. It's not like Plus, it's so difficult being a science educator. You know, you come with new practical, you've got to do a lot of work, you've got to try and everything else. Decent maths educator, as you say, you can deal, once you know about risk, probability, uncertainty, you can apply it from anything, whether it's hurricanes, money, low birth weight and deaths, income distribution related to mortality. Yeah.
Fantastic presentations from all of you. It really opened my mind to a whole load of things that I didn't know about, including the mollusk data. Judith mentioned some aspects of this, I think it was GCSE physics syllabus that could go. Oh, so this is a question really, because particularly at GCSE, I think we've got quite an overcrowded curriculum, and I think I'm entirely persuaded that we need to do things about sustainability and lots of different subject areas, and the interdisciplinarity of that came out strongly in what you all said too. But where would we cut? And this always seems to be the issue.
I think that actually, I mean, I know personally how much the Institute of Physics work is done, and their curriculum committee's been working for well over 10 years on thinking about, and they have submitted a document. I think the Institute of Biology's done the same, also their chemistry. We would all like there to be less content, and we've all made some very strong recommendations about how to very much the ideas of thinking like a physicist, a biologist and chemist of the distinctiveness of the subjects, but also thinking broadly around actually there should be an interplay between them. And there are some really, I would say, strong and helpful recommendations that I strongly encourage you to look at.
Now, I did notice Judith's example of what we could lose from GCSE science was monoclonal antibodies, which I could say is rarely taught by physicists. But seriously, I remember donkeys years ago, I was at the Institute of Biology, it was called then, was in charge of their biological nomenclature book, which was a nonsense. It was the classic where you had to supposedly learn more words in biology to get a top grade at GCSE than you did in French or German. And I lost 10% of the words in one day, and they published it. So you can. Now, you can't get the present Royal Society of Biology to agree which bits to slash, because as soon as you say, we don't need to teach the liver, you get the British Pathological Society suddenly saying, what are you going to rame us? You know, we're going to withdraw our subscription, and this person clearly knows nothing about the liver. But I will, you know, off the record or the right time, you can definitely, I'm not going to do it in biology, I leave others to do other subjects, but you can. Very briefly, A-level Salters non-film advanced biology, and we had a lovely person within Ofqual at that point we worked with. We just agreed we'd leave out the digestive system. We just thought they've learnt enough by GCSE about the digestive system. It's not very exciting to teach today. At least it's some of the best years of my life teaching it. We never got once, ever since then, a single complaint from anybody. Students, teachers, Ofsted, Ofqual. And so you can do it. And we really should. You haven't had a chance. You've been so nice.
Sorry.
Do you want to answer any questions about what is the geography be doing about climate change?
Would you like rocks back chemistry?
Yes.
That's why I like to stop teaching it.
Exactly. Big focus on that. Yeah.
Yeah, so because I had a similar question kind of framed in my mind to say, but thinking about the kind of maths and the geography, like, what do you want them to teach? Because it feels like there's both the question of reducing the content, and again, the Geographical Association RGS have made some good concrete kind of suggestions about areas that might be reduced. I think thinking across the kind of particularly Key Stage 3 and 4, the role of the exam certifications at Key Stage 4 playing this hugely powerful role, and actually kind of finding ways of schools reducing essentially repetition of GCSE content kind of dumbed down would give you a lot more scope for doing some more interesting stuff. But yeah, this question of from other subjects and that kind of cross-curricular question feels a really important one around climate change sustainability, to have a genuinely kind of joined up look across. I really love the work that Anne's colleagues here at ECI did, looking at maths and saying, right, let's not only have maths problems that are using money as an example,
and think about the way in which we use carbon and other things. And so lots of opportunities not only to reduce content, but actually just to tweak it so that the conversation about this more generally can be better informed. But your kind of point about digestive system does lead us to the drinks. So maybe we use that as a segue. So thank you again for joining us, and Judith and Joanne for hosting, and Joe, and thank you very much for having us. And we'll finish with close there. Unfortunately, we're not able to finish it. But Michael, thank you very much.
A brilliant segue there. Well done, Steve. Huge thanks to everyone. I'm just going to show, as a very last request from the Deanery, our little feedback form here. If you have a chance to give us a little bit of brief feedback about what you enjoyed about the event, anything that you would have liked to have had in addition or differently, we'd really appreciate that. Huge thanks to all of our speakers, and enjoy your drinks. Okay.